India has emerged as the fourth biggest military spender in the world after the United States, Russia and China, those in the pecking order. As per a report published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, India's military spending in 2022 was $81.4 billion, the fourth highest in the world. It was 6% more than 2021 and up about 47% from 2013. While New Delhi spent $81.4 billion, Beijing's expenditure was 3.5 times higher at an estimated $292 billion. Washington tops the list with an expenditure of $877 billion. The other two in the top five are Moscow with $86.4 billion and Riyadh, which is Saudi Arabia, at $75 billion. Total global military expenditure increased by 3.7% in real terms in 2022 to reach a new record high of $2,240 billion. Now, military expenditure in Europe saw its steepest year-on-year increase in at least last 30 years. So those are the numbers we're talking about here, to the tune of about $2,000 billion. With me at this point in time in the studio is my colleague Sandeep Unnithan, who is the editor for News9 Plus. Sandeep, thanks very much for joining us. What is driving India's military spend at this point in time? Before we go to the global sort of scenario, what's happening in the home?
Well, two problems really. A two-front war is what the military calls it. You have Pakistan on the western front and you have China on the northern front. And this is a scenario that Indian military planners have always warned of, the fact that you have twin enemies. You have a two-front war and the two enemies are close to each other. That among the closest relationships that China shares is with North Korea and with Pakistan. And it's a documented fact that over the last few decades, China has transferred nuclear weapons to Pakistan, missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles to Pakistan, and also substantial amounts of nuclear hardware, of defense hardware. So that essentially is the challenge that the Indian military is facing. China on one side, Pakistan on the other.
Okay. So, the data that we're getting at this point in time from CIPRI suggests that we were the third highest military spender, but the only country that has perhaps taken a position up a notch higher is Russia, with its spend likely to increase about 9%, not as much as Ukraine's, because the data here suggests that Ukraine's expenditure has increased, not just doubled, tripled, in fact, increased by as much as 640%.
Absolutely. And until last year, India was the third largest military spender. Look, the United States accounts for almost 50% of global military spending, and it spends more than the next 10 or 15 countries combined. China, for the last 3 decades almost, has been the second largest military spender. Almost 400 billion is what they spend, but there's a lot that's kept off the books. India in the last couple of years has crept up to the third position, but the fact that you mentioned Russia is now the number 3 military spender is a direct consequence of the war that they're fighting in Ukraine. And while Russian military spending is not substantial, it's Ukraine actually that's spending something like 40% of its entire GDP on defense.
Okay.
And what is important here is that this is the first war, the war of attrition that's being fought right now. The Russia-Ukraine war is possibly the first such war of attrition in Europe since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And a war of attrition is something where both sides are literally slugging it out in the battlefield using artillery and tanks and soldiers and drones and ballistic missiles and what have you. And this is the kind of war that people had not fought in a very long time, and that is being fought now. Battles of attrition cost a lot of money, right? Ammunition costs money, missiles cost money.
So what's costing how much money? In Indian specific terms, we're spending $81.4 billion. Where all is the money going towards? If you can break it down for us.
The Indian military spending is about, like you mentioned, 80 billion. 50% of that goes into salaries and pensions, more than 50% in fact, and the rest is spent on hardware and maintenance of equipment. But this is a very substantial chunk, what we spend on personnel and salaries and pensions. And that's the reason the government has been trying to cut down on this to increase spending on capital acquisitions, which is basically the buying of military hardware which you need to fight your enemies with. So this is one of the highest such ratios in the world, the capital to revenue expenditure in India. And the reason being that we have a very unique system where soldiers, you know, are hired at, they're recruited at the age of 18 and then they continue to about 30 and 40. And we have one of the largest standing armies in the world, and armies are not cheap. They cost a lot of money to maintain, salaries, pensions.
Coming to pensions and the money that is given towards maintenance of army personnel, with Agniveer now coming in and with the new pension scheme, how are things likely to change as far as expenditure towards military is concerned?
Well, that's a good question, and this is in response to this burgeoning salaries and pensions, and most importantly the pension bill. Like, I mean, to give you an example of how big the Indian pension bill is, the Indian military pension bill is, we spend double Pakistan's defense budget in pensions alone. And that's a very big figure. And this is not to take away from the fact, from the bravery of our soldiers, or the fact that they've rendered fantastic service under very difficult conditions. The Indian Army continues to be deployed at terrain that most armies would never deploy for even a few days, leave alone years, like in Siachen, for instance. But the fact is that at the end of the day, someone has to foot the bill. The government of India is finding it difficult now. They're looking in the future and they're seeing a pension and salaries burden that's going to eat up into the defense budget. To arrest that growth is what the reason that they've brought in the Agniveer scheme. And the Agniveer scheme is, it's not very new. In fact, 4 decades ago, this was exactly how the Indian Army was structured. You had a system where soldiers would come and they would have limited engagements for 10 and 15 years, and then they would go back into civvy street. But then in course of time, this kind of became a permanent arrangement where soldiers would spend increasingly 20 and 30 years in the system, and they would be eligible for pensions. And this is something that successive governments have kind of shied away from tackling until now. And that's what the Agniveer scheme essentially does. Is it will take time, it will take a couple of years down the line, a few decades, to reduce this pensions burden on the system.
Another interesting thing that I want to talk about here is India's self-reliance on defense equipment. Now, government has taken a lot of measures recently, increasing FDI from 49% to 74%, also creating a separate budget for buying locally made military hardware. What sort of impact has it had on imports in military?
Well, the thing is that measures like this take years to manifest themselves, and the fact is that for several years running, India has been the world's second largest importer of defense equipment. And when you import defense equipment, what in effect you're doing is you are subsidizing research in foreign countries, you're providing jobs in foreign countries, you're exporting talent, capital, and all of that. You're using Indian taxpayer money to create capacity in foreign countries. So in the last couple of years, what we have seen with the government's moves to ban imports literally in certain categories and to encourage the Indian private sector in a way that's never been done in the past, we are seeing the first glimmer of hope that we can actually cut down from being the second largest importer of arms to maybe drop down that list, and more importantly to climb up the list of arms exporting countries.
Arms exporting, where does India stand?
Well, we are at the bottom of the heap right now, but we have been making very increasingly very big steps in the last couple of years with very significant orders that have been placed. The big ones were for BrahMos missiles to the Philippines and for howitzers to Armenia. These are very big orders, and the fact is that at the end of the day, governments must back arms industries and they must push arms industries, because that's the way the business works across the world. Global military industrial complexes are a creation of nation states, and they are pushed by nations, and then eventually they assume a life of their own. And this is what the government of India has been doing. The baby steps. Private sector has been encouraged to take defense contracts in foreign countries. The public sector is getting orders as well. The BrahMos missiles that I told you is a combination of India and Russia, where both these countries have set up a joint venture firm. It's over 20 years old. They are now exporting to the Philippines. There's an order for Indonesia that's going to happen in the next couple of months, materialize. And of course, there are many other platforms and systems that have been identified as possible potential export deals. But I mean, there's still years to go before we can even come into the
and very ambitious target of $5 billion.
A very ambitious target of $5 billion.
How far are we from?
Well, not very far actually.
We are at 2.5.
We are about So in the next 1 or 2 years is when they believe that we can beat that target of $5 billion. But still, it's a drop in the ocean when you look at the overall global military industrial complex. The sales that are made is over $100 billion, and we are still, not even, we have not even explored the tip of the iceberg, if you can call it that.
Absolutely, and I want to go about to the global landscape at this point in time. We've seen an overall uptick of military expenditure, and mainly on the back of the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. How's that likely to pan out? How do you see military spending going forward from here, this year particularly?
Well, sadly, the global military industrial complex must be delighted with what's happening in the world today. You have a hot war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, and you have a cold war with China and Taiwan, with China threatening to invade and annex Taiwan. And I don't think there's been any time in the world in the last 75 years after the Second World War where two giants have really literally come together to threaten the world order as it is. And this fuels fear, and fear leads to increased budgetary spends, defense budget hikes of the kind that you've mentioned, and that results in more weapons buying. It results in the global military industrial complex benefiting and enlarging its footprint, and that's exactly what's going to happen in the next couple of years.
So 1 year post-war, we've seen a jump of 3.7%.
Yes.
Do you think tensions easing? So do you see a pause in military spending this year? We're talking about data from 2022.
Yeah, so the hot war might actually end sometime this year. There are predictions that it might last a few more months and it might come to an end by the end of 2023. But what's important is that after this hot war, you're going to get into the period of another cold war of the kind that you saw before 1991, where you have this uneasy peace, you have a demilitarized zone, you have tensions on both sides, and you will see the rearming of Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be recast as a quasi-NATO state with a lot of Western origin weapon systems. You're going to have, it's going to be everything short of a NATO country. And they're going to be, it's already happening as we speak, because NATO has, Ukraine has run through its inventory of Russian and Soviet origin weapons. It's now fighting on the backs of Western supplied equipment. And that is going to be resupplied, restocked. All of that is going to happen. Russia is going to be spending the next couple of years rearming itself. So that's going to, slow down its exports. That's what experts say, that it will slow down the Russian share of global defense exports, because they have to kind of cater for their war wastages over the last 14, 15 months or so. But all around, I don't see any possibility of global military sales going down or defense budgets going down, because at the end of the day, it's all about fear. And fear is what runs everything. Fear is what propels defense budget spends. Fear is what leads to the military industrial complex expanding its footprints. And with the kind of global geopolitical tensions that you're seeing in China and Russia and Europe and Taiwan and all that, this is going to continue for the next couple of years at least.
Okay, we were comparing the military spend between Ukraine and Russia. Interesting figures there. Ukraine's military spend marking a jump of 640%. Russia's barely 9.2%. So obviously the impact on Ukraine has been far higher, far wider.
So Ukraine is, and Cipri mentions that this is possibly the biggest jump they've ever seen in any country's defense spend. And what they've not factored in is that almost 20 or 30 billion dollars is coming in from the United States in terms of arms transfers. The UK has spent 2 billion pounds. They've sent it to the Ukrainians. Ukraine at the moment seems to be fighting what we once saw in the Second World War, which was a total war, where all resources of the state are diverted to fight a war. Germany fought a total war in the Second World War. The Soviet Union certainly fought one. Great Britain fought one. So we're coming back to that era of, countries which are under threat, which are fighting wars, literally plowing all the instruments of their state, all their resources into fighting that war. And that's one of the reasons that Ukraine has kind of been able to withstand this war for the last 14 months or so. Not also discounting the fact that they have had considerable Western assistance. They have had intelligence support from the United States and the Western countries and NATO. They've had a huge, they've literally, the NATO and the Western countries have opened up their war stocks to Ukraine. So like I said, I mean,
Right.
Ukraine is literally fighting with Western weapons now.
Okay.
So this is likely to continue in the near foreseeable future.
And the relationship between India and Russia, because India has sort of benefited from the war in Europe. The oil relationships have gotten better. In fact, the arms relationship are also better now. Russia becoming the biggest supplier of military equipments to India. Do you see that relationship continuing into the future?
Well, yeah, you know, simply because Russia has been one of India's most dependable allies, first as the Soviet Union, and then post 1991, Russia has been a very, very steady and dependable source of military equipment, and not just any military equipment, it's equipment of the kind that other countries would not even let you approach. What to talk of, you know, selling it to you or leasing it to you. For instance, nuclear submarines, nuclear powered attack submarines. Russia has been very you know, generous in kind of leasing us nuclear powered attack submarines. It's offered us long range strategic bombers. And these are platforms of the kind that no other country in the world transfers, sells, or even leases to other countries.
Okay.